It takes less than a night to lose a war. Not a campaign, not a battle, a war. One night where decisions collapse, where confidence turns into silence, where a man who once commanded millions realizes he no longer commands anything at all. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room, maps spread across a table that no longer mean what they used to. Every line, every arrow, every promise of victory suddenly feels like a lie. And somewhere in that silence, a general understands the truth. It's over. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. This is the story of a man who didn't just lose a war. He lost it in a single night. A night where reality finally caught up with illusion. A night where the strongest army in Europe became a broken force. A night where General Erich Ludendorff realized that everything he had built was already collapsing beneath him. But to understand that night, we have to go back. Because wars are never lost in a moment. They only reveal themselves in one. In August 1914, the German Empire marched into war with confidence bordering on arrogance. It possessed the most powerful army in the world. Its officers were disciplined, its industry unmatched, its planning meticulous. Across Europe, there was a belief that this war would be short, decisive, clean. Germany's strategy, influenced by the famous Schlieffen concept, aimed to crush France quickly and then turn east toward Russia. Speed was everything, precision was everything, and for a moment it almost worked. But war has a way of humbling certainty. At the Battle of the Marne, the advance stalled. French resistance, desperation, and timing stopped what was supposed to be an unstoppable force. That single moment changed everything. The war that was meant to last months stretched into years. Trenches replaced movement, attrition replaced strategy, and Germany found itself trapped in the one scenario it could not afford: a long war against enemies with greater resources. Still, defeat was not inevitable. That's what makes this story so unsettling. Germany didn't collapse because it was destined to. It collapsed because of decisions. Human decisions, miscalculations, risks that went too far, and a leadership that kept gambling long after the odds had turned against them. Over the next years, the cracks began to spread. The German high command struggled to adapt. Massive offensives like Verdun drained manpower without delivering victory. The British blockades slowly strangled the German economy, leading to shortages, hunger, and unrest at home. Alliances weakened, coordination faltered, and internally the structure of power became increasingly unstable. The Kaiser remained a symbolic figure, but real authority shifted toward military leaders who understood war, but not politics, not economics, not the fragile balance needed to sustain a nation under total strain. And then came one of the most critical decisions of all. In 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, hoping to starve Britain into submission. Instead, it brought a new enemy into the war: the United States. Fresh resources, fresh troops, fresh momentum. Suddenly, time was no longer just a factor. It was an enemy. Yet even then, there was still one final chance. When Russia collapsed after the Bolshevik Revolution, Germany found itself in a position it had been waiting for. The Eastern Front was gone. Vast territories were under German control. Divisions could now be moved west. For the first time since 1914, there was an opportunity to concentrate force and attempt a decisive blow before American troops fully arrived. And this is where our general steps fully into the story. By 1918, Erich Ludendorff was not just a commander. He was the architect of Germany's war effort, the man behind the strategy, the man carrying the weight of expectation. And perhaps most dangerously, the man who still believed victory was possible if one more gamble succeeded. That gamble came in the spring of 1918, a series of massive offensives known collectively as the Kaiserschlacht. Operation Michael was the first Udar. The goal was simple in theory and devastating in ambition: break the Allied lines, split British and French forces, force a collapse before reinforcements could stabilize the front. And at first it worked. German forces advanced further than anyone had seen since 1914. Tens of thousands of prisoners were taken. Allied lines bent under the pressure. For a brief moment, it looked like the impossible might happen, that Germany, against all odds, might still win. But there was a problem. Actually, there were many. The advances had no clear strategic endpoint. Objectives shifted constantly. Logistics struggled to keep up. Troops exhausted themselves pushing forward without adequate support. And most critically, the German army was consuming its best soldiers at an unsustainable rate. The elite stormtroopers, the backbone of these offensives, were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Victory was close enough to see, but never close enough to touch. And as the offensives continued through the summer, something subtle but devastating began to happen. Momentum faded. Resistance hardened. The Allies adapted, unified under leaders like Ferdinand Foch. Coordination improved. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. This is the part of the story most people miss. Wars don't always turn with explosions or dramatic breakthroughs. Sometimes they turn in quieter ways, in the slowing of an advance, in the hesitation of an order, in the growing realization that what once worked no longer does. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Ludendorff began to feel it, not publicly, not in speeches or reports, but internally. The numbers didn't add up anymore. The replacements weren't enough. The enemy wasn't breaking. And time, the one thing Germany needed to control, was slipping away. If you're still here, take a moment to think about that, because this isn't just history, it's human nature. How long do people hold on to a plan that's already failing? How often do we double down when we should step back? Let me know in the comments what you think. At what point does persistence become denial? Because for Ludendorff, that line was about to be crossed. And when it was, it didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in a single night. And that night did not begin with chaos. It began with reports, paper, numbers, quiet voices, the kind of atmosphere every veteran understands without needing it explained. No explosions, no gunfire, just the slow, suffocating accumulation of truth that no one wants to say out loud. By late summer of 1918, the illusion of control was already dissolving, even if the structure of command still stood intact. The German army was still in the field. It was still armed, still disciplined, still dangerous, but it was no longer winning in any meaningful sense. And deep down, the men who understood war could feel it. The turning point came on August 8, 1918, a date that would later be burned into memory not just as a defeat, but as a psychological fracture. Near Amiens, Allied forces launched a coordinated offensive unlike anything the Germans had faced before. Infantry advanced alongside tanks in large numbers. Artillery was precise, overwhelming, and synchronized. Aircraft supported movements in ways that made concealment nearly impossible. It was modern warfare evolving in real time, and Germany was no longer ahead of it. The result was immediate and deeply unsettling. Positions that should have held collapsed faster than expected. Units that had resisted for years began to withdraw in disorder. Entire formations surrendered, not in isolated incidents, but in waves. Thousands of soldiers laid down their weapons, not because they lacked courage, but because something far more fundamental had broken inside them. Erich Ludendorff would later call it the Black Day of the German Army. But even that phrase doesn't fully capture what happened, because what was lost that day wasn't just ground, it was belief. For 4 years, German soldiers had endured conditions that are almost impossible to imagine. Endless artillery barrages, mud that swallowed men whole, gas attacks that burned lungs from the inside. They had survived Verdun. They had endured the Somme. They had pushed forward in offensives that demanded everything and gave almost nothing back. Through all of it, there was one thing that kept them going: the belief that it would eventually mean something. That belief died at Amiens. And once belief is gone, discipline can only hold for so long. From that moment forward, the war shifted into something quieter, but far more decisive. The Allies did not need a single, overwhelming breakthrough. They only needed pressure. Constant, unrelenting pressure. And that is exactly what they applied. Day after day, the front moved. Not dramatically, not in the sweeping advances people imagine when they think of victory, but steadily, relentlessly. The kind of advance that wears you down psychologically before it destroys you physically. Every kilometer lost was another confirmation that the war was slipping away. Every retreat order carried a little less confidence than the last. And inside German command, the situation was becoming increasingly fragile. Communication began to strain under pressure. Reports contradicted each other. Some commanders painted overly optimistic pictures, either out of habit or fear. Others reported the truth more bluntly, describing units that were no longer combat effective, soldiers who refused to advance, officers who could no longer maintain authority. Supply lines were stretched thin. Ammunition shortages became more frequent. Food was scarce, not just at the front, but back home. Civilians were suffering, workers were striking. There were whispers of revolution, growing louder with each passing week. And yet, officially, the war continued. Because admitting defeat is not just a strategic decision, it's a psychological breaking point. Ludendorff was still issuing orders, still trying to shape outcomes, still searching for a way to stabilize the front. But internally, something had changed. The clarity that once defined him was fading. In its place was something far more dangerous than fear: uncertainty. He began to react instead of lead, to respond instead of anticipate. Decisions became fragmented, short-term, focused on immediate problems rather than long-term survival. And in war, that shift is fatal. At the same time, Germany's allies were collapsing one by one. The Ottoman front was deteriorating under sustained Allied offensives. Bulgaria surrendered, opening a direct path into the heart of the Central Powers. Austria-Hungary, already weakened by internal divisions, began to fracture under pressure. Nationalist movements rose. The empire was no longer stable. It was disintegrating. Germany was no longer fighting a war. It was standing alone in the ruins of an alliance that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. And this is where the story becomes deeply human, because by the time we approached that night, the outcome was already decided in reality. The war was lost in terms of resources, positioning, and momentum. But inside the command structure, inside the minds of those responsible, there was still resistance to that truth. That's the final stage of collapse, when reality and belief no longer match. And if you're following this story closely, this is where I want to pause for a second, because this moment matters. Not just in history, but in how we understand leadership, decisions, and human limits. If this kind of deep, realistic storytelling is valuable to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you think, and it keeps stories like this alive and reaching the people who understand them. Now, back to that night. By late September 1918, the reports arriving at headquarters became impossible to reinterpret. There was no positive angle left, no strategic optimism to extract. The numbers were clear. The situation was clear. The army was at its limit. Replacements were insufficient and often poorly trained. Veteran units had been depleted beyond recovery. Morale was critically low, not just among soldiers, but among officers as well. And across the front, the Allies were growing stronger every day, reinforced by fresh American troops who had not yet experienced the exhaustion of years in the trenches. Time was gone, and for the first time, fully and undeniably, Ludendorff understood it. It was over. But saying those words meant confronting something far larger than military defeat. It meant acknowledging that everything built since 1914 had failed. that millions of lives had been spent in a war that could no longer be justified, that the German Empire itself might not survive what came next. And so, for a brief moment, there was hesitation, not because the facts were unclear, but because the consequences were unbearable. Then came the night. It was late September. The headquarters was quiet, in the way only military command centers can be. Controlled, structured, almost detached. Officers moved with purpose. Messages were delivered. Orders were still being written. On the surface, everything functioned as it always had. But underneath that surface, something fundamental had shifted. Erich Ludendorff sat with the reports in front of him. Not theories, not predictions, facts. There was no path to victory, no maneuver left to attempt, no reserve strong enough to change the outcome, no ally capable of stabilizing the situation. The war, as it had been fought, was finished. This is the moment people expect to be dramatic, but it wasn't. Because when denial finally breaks, it doesn't explode. It settles. There was no outburst, no theatrical reaction, just a decision that carried the weight of everything that had come before it. Germany had to seek an armistice, immediately. Not after one last offensive, not after regrouping, not after negotiating from a position of strength. There was no strength left to negotiate from. Within hours, the message moved through the chain of command. The government was informed. The language was direct, almost cold in its clarity. The military situation was hopeless. Continuing the war would lead only to complete collapse. The only remaining option was to seek peace before that collapse became uncontrollable. Think about that. 4 years of war, millions of soldiers, entire nations reshaped. And it all came down to a single realization, in a single night, inside a quiet room filled with paper and silence. The war was lost. Not when the first shot was fired, not when the last battle was fought, but when the man in command could no longer deny the truth in front of him. And what followed was something even he could no longer control. And what followed was not silence, it was collapse. Not the kind that happens all at once, not a sudden explosion of chaos, but something slower, heavier, the kind of collapse that spreads to a system already weakened, already fractured, already holding itself together by routine rather than strength. The decision had been made. Germany would seek an armistice. But decisions, even the right ones, do not stop consequences. They release them. In the days after that night, the reality Ludendorff had recognized began to surface everywhere. At the front, soldiers continued to fight, but something had changed in the way they fought. Orders were followed, but without conviction. Positions were held, but without belief. The difference is subtle, but every veteran understands it. There is a moment when a soldier stops believing in the outcome, even if he continues to perform his duty. And once that moment spreads, an army becomes something else entirely. It becomes a force waiting for the end. The Allied advance continued without pause. What would later be called the 100 Days Offensive pushed German forces back across ground they had fought years to defend. There were still acts of resistance, still moments of discipline, still flashes of the army that had once dominated Europe. But they were no longer enough to change anything. Because the war was no longer being decided at the front, it was being decided behind it. Inside Germany, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Food shortages turned into unrest. Unrest turned into protest. Protest began to resemble revolution. Workers walked out of factories. Sailors refused orders. Entire units began to question authority, not in whispers but openly. The structure that had supported the war effort was breaking apart. And once that happens, no army, no matter how disciplined, can hold a nation together. Ludendorff had made the correct military decision. But the consequences of that decision moved beyond military control almost immediately. By admitting that the war could not be won, he had also exposed the fragility of everything behind it. The government, already strained, struggled to manage the transition. Civilian leadership was suddenly forced into a position it had not prepared for. Negotiations had to begin, but from a position of weakness that few were willing to accept. This is where history becomes uncomfortable, because defeat is rarely accepted cleanly. Instead of unity, there was confusion. Instead of clarity, there was blame. Some refused to believe the army had truly been defeated. Others insisted that the collapse came from within, not from the battlefield. Narratives began to form, not based on facts, but on the need to make sense of something that felt impossible. How could an army that had advanced so far, that had fought so hard, that had come so close, suddenly be finished? But that's the nature of collapse. It always looks sudden from the outside, even when it has been building for years. As October turned into November, the pressure intensified. Germany's allies were gone. The front was falling back. The population was no longer stable, and the demand for peace became impossible to ignore. Negotiations accelerated. Terms were discussed. Conditions were set. And then on November 11th, 1918, the fighting stopped. The armistice was signed. The war was over. But for Ludendorff, that moment was not a victory of peace. It was the confirmation of everything that had unfolded since that night. The realization that what he had understood in silence had now become reality for the entire world. And yet, even then, the story does not end cleanly. Because losing a war is one thing. Understanding how it was lost is something else entirely. In the years that followed, debates would continue. Historians would analyze decisions, strategies, missed opportunities. Names like Erich Ludendorff would be examined, criticized, defended. Some would argue that the war had been unwinnable after 1914. Others would point to specific moments where different choices might have changed the outcome. But beneath all of that analysis, one truth remains. The war was not lost in a single battle. It was not lost in a single decision. It was revealed in a single night. The night when illusion gave way to reality. The night when a general stopped asking how to win and started asking how to end it. And that is why this story matters, not because of strategy, not because of maps or movements or numbers, but because of what it says about people, about how long we hold on, about how hard it is to let go, about the moment when we finally see things as they are, not as we want them to be. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, then you already understand that this isn't just about World War I. It's about something much deeper. The weight of responsibility, the burden of command, the quiet, invisible moments where everything changes, and no one outside the room even knows it's happening. So here's something to think about. How many endings in life don't look like endings at all? How many wars, personal or otherwise, are already lost long before anyone admits it? And when that moment comes, would you recognize it? Or would you keep going, hoping the next decision might still change everything? If this story made you think, take a moment to leave your perspective in the comments. I read them, and I value them, especially from those who understand what it means to carry responsibility under pressure. And if you want more stories like this, grounded, human, and real, consider subscribing and leaving a like. Not for algorithms, but so these stories continue to reach people who see beyond the surface. Because history is not just about what happened. It's about what we're willing to understand from it. And sometimes the most important battles are the ones that end in silence.